On the day for the first flight, the gentleman on the right is the son of Don Hines. Don had two sons who were in the Marines, flying F-18s. Unfortunately, the first son was killed in a training accident. The second son, Ben Hines, flies F-18s out of San Diego, and he came out with a student to witness the test flight. Absolutely wonderful. Ben wanted us to know that the family was still behind the restoration of the aircraft to make sure that we can tell this story and connect with all the Tuskegee Airmen in the country. Well, this is just the minutes prior to the first run-up of this Merlin engine, our backup engine. So they're checking the hoses, all the clamps, all of the fittings before we actually start the engine. This is funny. It's hard to hold down a Mustang when you're revving it up to 67 or 60 inches of manifold pressure. Well, in North Dakota, you tie it down to the fire plug and you hope that the plug stays there when you're revving it up. You just don't use tie downs that are on the ramp. So this is after the engine was started and they're actually checking the engine operationally. It's tied to the fire plug. This is the engine with the cowling off of it, of course. And after you stop the engine, you want to make sure you don't have leaks, that things are still sealed properly. This is the post-engine run check on the Rolls-Royce Merlin, which develops 1,500 horsepower, 1,490 horsepower. The propeller on this is roughly 11 feet 2 inches. It's a very large propeller, and as a result, you've heard about the torque on the Mustang, and I can attest that there's quite a bit of torque when you're taking off this aircraft. This is the first flight. We don't have all the paint on the aircraft. Unfortunately, I was on a Delta trip. I couldn't attend. This shot was taken from the AT-6 chase plane. The pilot is Doug Rosendahl. This is again Doug on the takeoff. That's a great shot. Normally for takeoff, you set in or preset about 6 degrees of right rudder to compensate for the airplane wanting to turn to the left. And it wants to turn to the left for a number of reasons. You have the propeller slipstream, you have torque, gyroscopic precession. The same things that affect us when we're flying models that are tail draggers affect the big airplanes only more dynamically, more so on a larger scale. This is another shot of the aircraft passing overhead. The first flight, we had the gear down for a while, making sure that was okay, and then you cycle the gear up and down. It takes about 15 to 12 seconds for the gears to work. And also the gear doors on the Mustang work sequentially. That means when the airplane is under power and you have hydraulics, you have the gear and the inner door gears are actually up and folded into the fuselage. When you put the gear up, the inner door wells actually move open, the gear comes up, and then the inner doors actually close. It takes about 15 seconds for it to happen. This is an in-flight shot from the T-6. This is my arrival in Oshkosh last year. Doug Rosenthal checked me out in the aircraft, and people ask, what is the checkout? The checkout for the CAF is 2 check rides in the back seat of a T-6. The reason you do the back seat or rear seat of the T-6 is to simulate the long nose of having a fighter. Also, when you fly these tail draggers, you'll notice a lot of times the aircraft do S-turns. That's because you can't see over the nose when you're taxiing and you don't want to run into anything. So you will see tail draggers S-turning. They should be all the time when they're taxiing. I was very, very happy to see when I pulled into Oshkosh also Colonel Charles McGee greeting me, because Charles had been on board with the project. I had not been checked out 4 years ago, so he was very happy to see me driving the aircraft in. And also, as I mentioned, the checkout with Doug Rosendahl, who flew the chase plane, flying lead. After I passed both check rides, Doug actually said to me, before I closed the canopy, he said, "Brad, have you ever heard of the astronaut's prayer?" And I said, "No, Doug, I haven't heard the astronaut's prayer." Would you like to hear it? I said, sure. He goes, here it is. Dear God, please don't let me mess up. But he didn't say mess. And then he patted me on the head and said, have a good flight. Now, this is at Oshkosh, again, after having been checked out maybe 2 hours in the aircraft. And I can tell you this, no matter how much time you have flying, when you step into a World War II fighter, you're focused on making sure you come back in one piece and trying to remember everything they've told you about taking that aircraft out. So, needless to say, I was focused on the takeoff, making sure I didn't swerve left or right. Once the gear's up, you accelerate to 170 miles an hour, which is the best glide speed. And then I climbed up to altitude in case anything happened. Now, as I was proceeding down to Doug's airport on my first solo flight, and he's flying lead in his Harmon rocket, two things happened. First, he started talking about my father's history with Tuskegee and how Don Hines would be happy to see me flying this aircraft. And at that time, I still get teared up about it. He's mentioning the history of me being involved with the project and how many volunteers we had with the Red Tail Project, Tuskegee. And I'm starting to tear up inside this Mustang. So I get on the radio and Doug, this is not the time to try to get an emotional response out of me. I just want to get this airplane back on the ground. We can do the kumbaya stuff once we get on the ground, but right now all I want to do is fly this properly and land. So Doug said, okay. So everything's great, it flies like an airplane. I'm not thinking about anything at the time except for just monitoring the temperature, the coolant, etc. So about 15 minutes later, Doug says to me, well, I guess it's time to come down. So of course the focus goes from here back to about here, because now I have to get this thing back on the ground. Now as it happened, the landing was uneventful. It's actually easier to land with the wide landing gear than a T6. But you're still landing a Mustang. So my concentration was the speeds, of course. In this aircraft, it's 115 to 120 miles per over the fence. And then just flying the tail down as you would with any aircraft, RC aircraft. And then, God help me, I had a crosswind, and I just was going to make sure I stayed straight on that runway come hell or high water. And finally, as I pulled into where Doug was, I shut down the engine. I thought, I sold the aircraft without wrecking it. And so that was my first solo experience in the Mustang. This is Colonel Charles McGee greeting me in Oshkosh 2009. Another shot of Colonel McGee 2009. This is a landing. The tail was down on the Mustang at this point in time, but if you actually have the aircraft level, there's not much clearance between that 11-foot 2-inch prop and the ground. So you try to land with a slightly positive attitude. These are all the wing members from South St. Paul, Minneapolis, part of the Southern Minnesota CF wing. Steve Brown is the new leader of the Commemorative Air Force. He's been doing some great things for the organization, taking us into the computer age and trying to solidify the membership, reaching out in new ways. If you didn't know, we have the B-29 Fifi up and flying as of last year.